The corridors of the quiet, dusky-eye psychiatric hospital have always seemed dark and endless, like a labyrinth in which the deepest part of the human soul is lost. The main building of the hospital dates back to the 19th century, and its gloomy architecture has left its mark on every wall and in every shadow. It is here that a dark story unfolds that cannot be forgotten. Spring brought with it not only blooming flowers and gentle sunshine, but also a new patient for the dusky eye. Ellen Wright was a young woman, barely 25 years old, yet her brown eyes looked at the world through her fingers, as if she saw something that everyone else could not comprehend. Her gaze was clouded, and her smile was artificial. She entered the hospital without a single relative or friend, and her story remained a mystery. From her first days in the hospital, Ellen exhibited strange behavior. She would sit on the edge of her bed for hours, listening to an invisible tune and immersing herself in her thoughts. The doctors and nurses were puzzled by her behavior, but tried to understand and help her. Over time, however, it became clear that Ellen was not just mentally ill. There was something dark and strange lurking in her eyes, like a demon trying to break free. She began to talk about the strange visions she had seen in her dreams. Every night she had nightmares in which she saw dark shadows lurking in the corners of the hospital and eerie voices whispering to her. The hospital staff began to feel an overwhelming fear of Ellen. A strange atmosphere enveloped the building, as if it were the cause of her nightmares. A few weeks after her admission to the hospital, strange and frightening events began to occur. At first they were insignificant, doors closing by themselves, lights suddenly going out in Ellen's room, frightening sounds coming from the depths of the hospital. But as time went on, the events became more and more creepy and inexplicable. One night, Nurse Linda decided to check on Ellen's condition. When she entered her room, she saw an eerie sight. Ellen was lying on her bed, her eyes glistening in the darkness, and shadows hovering around her like living shadows. Linda tried to scream, but her voice failed. She could feel the fear gripping her body, and she couldn't even move. Suddenly, the shadows began to approach Linda, coiling around her like snakes. She could feel them penetrating her mind, sucking the life force out of her. In the morning, Linda was found unconscious in Ellen's room. The doctors could find no explanation for her condition, and she spent several days in a coma. When she finally regained consciousness, her account of what had happened made everyone in the hospital shudder with horror. With each passing day, the events became more horrifying and incomprehensible. Patients and hospital staff began to see ghosts and hear inhuman voices. Reports of ominous shadows and eerie visions began to appear more frequently in medical journals. The hospital building seemed to come alive, revealing dark secrets that had lurked within its walls for years. Eventually, fear and chaos took over the hospital. Patients ran through the hallways in panic and screamed across the floor. The hospital staff went insane, and the atmosphere became increasingly saturated with sinister forces. Life at Dusky Eye became an endless nightmare from which there was no escape. Eventually, the hospital had to be closed. It became a place of fear and terror, and no one wanted to mess with the gloomy building anymore. Over time, the story of the Dusky Eye became a legend, told in whispers and by campfire light. But no one knew what became of Ellen Wright. Her fate remained a mystery, as did many other terrible events that took place within the walls of the Dusky Eye. But even years after the closure of the hospital, they say that in its ruined corridors continue to live dark forces, and at night there are strange sounds and visions, as if the souls of dead patients still roam here. The clock on Nurse Maria's wall ticked slowly, creating a monotonous rhythm that seemed endless to her. She was sitting in her cozy office at the White Sun Psychiatric Hospital, where she had been working for several years. Maria was a caring and kind nurse, always ready to help patients suffering from various mental disorders. But even the most virtuous of souls could find themselves drawn into the nightmare that lurked behind the hospital walls. One cold fall evening, when the corridors were empty and the silence was pierced only by rustles and the sounds of distant music, Maria stood near the nurse's station rereading medical records. Suddenly, she felt a strange chill that swept over her body, as if a cold breeze had penetrated her soul. She tried to ignore the feeling, but something inside made her turn around. Standing in front of her in the hallway was a patient she had never seen before. The man was tall and thin. His pale face seemed almost white, and his black eyes sparkled in the darkness. He wore an old beige hospital robe as if it were his second skin. "You? Who are you?" Maria asked uncertainly, clutching the file folder in her hand. The patient approached slowly, his footsteps sounding heavy and uneven, as if he was in a state of deep apathy. Maria felt fear climbing into her heart, but she tried to remain calm. "My name is Damien," the man said in a low and eerie voice that reverberated in Maria's ears like an ominous whisper. "What do you want?" she asked, trying not to show her concern. "I'm looking for my past life," Damien replied, his black eyes staring into Maria's eyes as if penetrating her very being. "Your past life?" the nurse interjected, trying to figure out what he was talking about. Damien nodded slowly as if trying to remember something distant and lost. "I had dreams, nightmares full of blood and fear. I'm sure it wasn't my life, but something inside me tells me otherwise." Maria felt her hands shaking, and she realized that the patient in front of her was no ordinary patient. This was a man who carried a secret that connected him to this hospital. "I can help you," she said, trying to reassure the man. "But first, let's talk. Tell me what you remember." Damien began to tell his strange story. He spoke of an ancient ritual he'd seen in his nightmares, a sinister cult that practiced dark rites, awakening the dead and summoning spirits. He told of how he felt his soul was connected to this area, to this hospital. The nurse listened to his story, feeling the fear gripping her more and more. She found it hard to believe these sinister stories, but something in Damien's voice made her believe his words. With each meeting, Damien revealed to Maria more and more details of his strange connection to the hospital. He talked about the mysterious past lives he had seen in his visions and the power that had begun to awaken within him. The nurse began to be drawn deeper and deeper into this sinister world shrouded in darkness and mystery. As time went on, events became increasingly strange and terrifying. Patients began to see ghosts and hear whispers in the dark. Doctors were amazed by unexplained cases of patients disappearing, their footprints simply vanishing into thin air. White Sun Hospital had become a place of nightmares and fear, and Maria realized that Damien and his story had everything to do with it. She began researching the hospital archives, investigating the strange man's story. She found old documents about the rituals and cult that Damien had spoken of. The ancient records mentioned a mysterious group that practiced dark rituals in an attempt to gain immortality and power over souls. Maria realized she was caught in the web of a sinister story that had been dragging on for years. She decided to unravel the mysteries of the past, to save not only herself, but all the patients of the hospital from the ancient evil. Deeper and deeper she delved into the secrets and darkness, uncovering the horrific events that lay hidden behind the walls of the hospital. She discovered a connection between Damien and one of the secret rites that took place here years ago. Each step of her investigation became more dangerous and more frightening. Maria didn't give up, however. She fought her fears and despair, finding support in her faith and her desire to protect those who needed her. She uncovered secrets and untangled knots, eventually confronting the very dark forces that brought the hospital to life. The final confrontation was horrific and indescribable. Mary found herself face to face with the ancient evil spirits that had been summoned to life by terrible rites. In a battle for life and souls, Mary used all her strength to fight this ancient evil. Finally, after a long and struggling battle, Mary was able to defeat the dark forces and bring them back to the depths of the past. She realized that her devotion and fortitude were the key to defeating the evil that was consuming the hospital. After this event, White Sun Hospital began to clear the sinister atmosphere, and the patients began to feel relief. Maria became a true hero for the hospital, but she knew that Damien's story and the dark forces he had awakened would remain in her memory forever. As time passed, White Sun became once again a place of hope and healing, but there was always a forgotten echo of the terrible events within its walls. Maria continued to work as a nurse, but now she had something more: the experiences she had overcome and the strength that had helped her defeat ancient dark forces. Though much time had passed, the story of the white sun and its struggle with darkness remained vivid in the memory of Maria and anyone who had ever encountered the place. In the deep woods, hidden from the view of the common people, stood the abandoned building of the Twilight Psychiatric Hospital. In the past, it had been a place to treat the mentally ill, but now it seemed like a forgotten ghost, shrouded in darkness and mystery. No patient had appeared here in years, and only the shadow of the past remained, as if hanging in the air. Guard Mark Harrison was a determined and brave man who was destined to say goodbye to the world at Twilight Psychiatry. His job was to guard the asylum and protect it from possible intruders. He had never believed in the supernatural, preferring to stick to facts and logic, but even he began to doubt his beliefs when one day his courage collided with the darkness. One overcast evening, Mark began his regular patrol shift. He walked the perimeter, checking locked doors and windows, making sure everything was in order. Night had fallen on the hospital, and Mark decided to take a short break in his office, located in the center of the building. The office was filled with old medical books, medicine cabinets, and a desk stacked with papers. Mark sat down at the desk and began reading his favorite book, trying to forget about the world around him and enjoy a moment of peace. But his tranquility was broken by the sound of knocking in the distance. Mark lifted his eyes from the page, listening intensely. Again the knocking, this time closer. His heart beat faster as he rose from his seat, preparing himself for a possible threat. Suddenly his office door swung open and Dr. Anna Collins, the head psychiatrist at Twilight Psychiatric Hospital, stepped inside. "Mark, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sounding strangely quiet and wary. I was just reading," Mark replied, trying to hide his nervousness. "We need to talk," Dr. Collins said, and her eyes sparkled in the gloom as if she carried some secret with her. They sat down at the table and Dr. Collins began to tell Mark a strange story. She told of a patient named Elizabeth who had been declared insane and confined in a hospital years ago. Elizabeth claimed that there was something sinister hidden in the hospital building, something she called the shadow. She said that the shadow was waiting for its moment to return and destroy all living things, Dr. Collins pronounced, her voice sounding strangled. Mark felt goosebumps run down his back. "Do you believe that?" Dr. Collins shook her head. "I don't know what to believe, but there's something strange about this place, something I can't explain." As time went on, they began to notice more and more strange and horrifying happenings in the hospital. Staff began to see ghosts, patients told of creepy nightmares, and Mark began to feel that something dark and sinister was beginning to creep into his mind. One night, as a downpour flooded the hospital windows, Mark decided to make extra rounds. His flashlight illuminated the hallways, creating ominous shadows on the walls. Suddenly he heard a faint rustling in the distance. He strained to listen, trying to discern the source of the sound. Suddenly something swept past him in the darkness, leaving behind a trail of flickering light. Mark ran after the arrow of light that led him through the abandoned corridors and rooms. The light faded and reappeared as if it were leading Mark forward. He didn't know how much time had passed until he finally found himself in a forgotten wing of the hospital. In front of him was a room illuminated by a flickering light. Inside, Mark saw Dr. Collins standing in front of a huge mirror hung with strange symbols. Dr. Collins began to whisper incomprehensible words monotonously, and her eyes sparkled like magic fire. "Doctor, what are you doing?" shouted Mark, feeling fear take over him. Dr. Collins turned to him, and the daisy ribbon flickered brighter in her eyes. The shadow comes alive in this night." Mark felt something invisible begin to envelop his body, and he realized he was going to pass out. But before it was all gone, he saw a slowly distorted image begin to emerge from the mirror of his own reflection. When Mark regained consciousness, he found himself in a dark room, locked from the inside. He realized that the hospital no longer belonged to the world of the living, and he remained trapped there with Dr. Collins, who had become a puppet in the hands of the shadow. Many years had passed since that moment, and Mark and Dr. Collins remained inside the Twilight Psychiatric Hospital, suffering the eternal torment of the shadow's possession. Night after night they served the shadow, serve her forever, and only their whispers vanished in the winds of time, never to reach the ears of the living, leaving only darkness and mystery in the memory of the past.